Hello, everyone. In this video, we're going to be discussing Act II of The Tempest by Shakespeare. This act begins with a presentation of the various different noble characters, or purportedly noble characters, on the island as they begin to explore the island and find the materials that are necessary for them to survive. However, they really just appear to be meandering along aimlessly without purpose. And that's largely because the head of their company, the king, Alonso, has essentially lost control of his mental faculties. He's lost everything and he is mired in grief. So physically, he is wandering about aimlessly in the same way that he is so mentally and emotionally at the loss of his son Ferdinand. He believes that Ferdinand has perished in this great storm, and he refuses all attempts at comfort. These characters have encountered what seems to be an utterly and completely desolate wasteland. One of the reasons for that is that much as Gonzalo seems to view this island as a place of potentiality or possibility, all the various different characters essentially make this island into what they bring into it. Each of the characters essentially reforms the island based on their own mental faculties, their emotional states, and their expectations. So the island is essentially transformed as they would wish it, or as their own mental and emotional states make it. Different interpretations of the island and effects, and its effects, essentially render into reality those expectations. The island reveals the emotional states of characters and their intentions. In the first section of this act, the characters essentially bicker and battle. They're engaged in various games of wit as they attempt to deride and mock each other. The separation from the trappings of civilization have unbounded them from the demands of civility. Their response to the dissolution of hierarchies is essentially fractious disunity, and in the case of Sebastian and Antonio, plots to murder the Duke or murder the King of Naples and take his position. In line 104 in the written edition of the play, Alonso says, "You cram these words into mine ear against the stomach of my senses." Right? So my senses, my hearing, has no stomach. It has no ability to like digest and to feed off of these things that you're saying to me. It's like you're cramming food down my throat and it's making me sick in the way that you're cramming this advice into my ear. Would that I had never married my daughter there, for coming thence my son is lost, and in my rate she too, who is so far from Italy removed, I ne'er shall see her again. O thou mine heir of Naples and Milan, what strange fish hath made his meal on thee? So the Duke here has revealed that he was traveling back from the marriage of his daughter. He was giving his daughter in marriage to a king in Tunis. And during this trip back, he believes now he has lost both his children, one to marriage in a distant land and one to the seas and the oceans. The disagreement between the other characters that leads into this moment, this explosion of anger on Alonso's part, reveals the way in which these conflicts and this desperate desire to usurp each other and to assert themselves over each other in this power hierarchy as they jockey for position triggers more disagreements. For them, in their party, the smallest of disagreements spirals outward into chaos. Now, Shakespeare seems to be suggesting through these interactions among these noblemen, right, rulers and kings, that politicking and the minute disagreements between political figures is forever in danger of sending men tumbling into chaos. We also have a contrast between the calm order of Prospero, the kind of civilization that he has wrested out of chaos, that he has constructed in this new land at the end of Act 1, Scene 1, or Act 1, Scene 2, rather, and the chaotic maelstrom of emotionalism and backbiting that we see in this party. Prospero has a kind of command over language. It is his spells, after all, that allows him to control the island, to render into reality whatever he desires. His language, his theatrical art, his magic, all of them essentially make him fit for rule. But that's not always the case. Sebastian and Antonio have wit. They seem far more intelligent, perspicacious, and, well, witty than does Gonzalo. And yet they're cruel and mocking, deriding Alonso for the loss of his children and for essentially undertaking the actions that have resulted in them getting stranded there in their view. They mock Gonzalo's optimism. And in a way, his optimism seems utterly ridiculous, and yet they treat him with no, let's say, gentleness or patience. So when he says in line 52 that the grass looks lush and lusty, they mock him. Well, the ground is indeed tawny. So they're offering these sarcastic jibes and interjecting them into his observations to undercut him at each turn. They again demonstrate that kind of antagonistic wit by claiming that he is winding up the watch of his wit, and by it will strike. So they're comparing him and his torturous, laborious, mechanical thoughts to like a watch that's being wound up. And then just when it strikes the right hour, the cuckoo will ring out or the bell will be rung. He's winding up the watch of his wit. So they're constantly interjecting these witty and in rather clever insults, but they're cruel, and they threaten to actually throw this party into chaotic disunity. Though they're humorous and though they're intelligent, they lack any kind of humanity. To them and in them, everything is acerbic and denigrating. In line 121, after Alonso begins to say, no, no, he's gone, he assures them that, yes, my son is dead. Sebastian, in an act of abject cruelty, says, sir, you may thank yourself for this great loss. So he's again essentially piling on to this man who is already distraught over the loss of his son and blaming him for it. That may be true. It may be that Alonso's decisions have led to this point, but it's still abjectly cruel. Shakespeare, in this moment of cruelty, in this unification of harshness and tenderness that we discussed earlier on, as certain characters like Gonzalo and Francisco are attempting to comfort and offer succor and aid and hope to Alonso, even if it's false, even if it's not true, and they're only trying to keep his spirits up so that he will not descend into the depths of depression and actually lead them all to death because their commander has lost his wits. And harshness in the reactions of characters like Alonso, Antonio, and Sebastian. Francisco offers us a kind of, or I should say Shakespeare through Francisco, offers us a commentary on the power of storytelling. Ultimately, this is a play about storytelling, as so many of Shakespeare's works are. Prospero himself is like a storyteller. He concocted the very first scene of this play, right? The play that we're reading seems like it's under the direction of Prospero. Here we have a direct commentary on storytelling as Francisco tells a story to Alonso in an attempt to comfort and encourage him. He says around line 111, and in this case, line 120, sir, he may live. I saw him beat the surges under him and ride upon their backs. So Alonso is despairing, and then Francisco interjects and tells the story about the nobility, the bravery, the strength and courage of Alonso's son. Alonso believes that he's been swept overboard and killed, or that he was earlier on, and Francisco says, no, he survived. I know, I saw him. Sir, he may live. I saw him beat the surges under him and ride upon their backs. He trod the water whose enmity he flung aside and breasted the surge most swollen that had met him. So there's this heroic quest to overcome the powers of nature as Ferdinand uses all the strength of his youth to plow through these tempestuous waves and try to make it to shore. His bold head above the contentious waves he kept, so he kept his head above water, and oared himself with his good arms in lusty stroke to the shore, that o'er his wave-worn basis bowed, as stooping to relieve him. I not doubt he came alive to land. We have the unification of harshness and tenderness in action, but also in language. Alonso's language, as he describes them cramming these words into my ears against the stomach of my senses, is this sort of repugnant image of being force-fed. And yet, immediately after that, transitioning from that, building from that harshness and that vileness, is the resplendent description of human agency, human will being set against nature and triumphing in the face of it. Right? The victory of Ferdinand over the surging waves. The imagery itself is formal and deferential as Ferdinand, or Francisco rather, speaks to Alonso in respectful terms. And it's an incredibly effective and affecting, emotionally effective narrative of courage and prowess. As a metaphor, at least, it's incredibly uplifting, conveyed and couched in elegant phraseology. even if Ferdinand is dead, through the story that he tells of Ferdinand's valiant efforts to overcome nature, perhaps his valiant efforts to fight against the inevitability of his own death, he still proclaims and preserves the honorable memory of Ferdinand, even if, as I said, he's gone. So storytelling in this moment breaks through the misery and the ugliness of Alonso's recollections, and it offers him at least the chance for comfort by elevating the memory of Ferdinand, the identity of Ferdinand, into this rarefied level. All of these interactions are part of Shakespeare's attempt to call us to question and to consider the nature of authority and the systems of authority that exist in the world. What is it that truly makes a man or a woman fit to rule? What gives a person the right to rule? When we see how characters can come to rule, right, through deception and tyranny, how they can shirk their responsibilities, as both Prospero and Alonso here do, the right to rule and the position of rulers is suddenly fraught with complexities and uncertainties. Likewise, Caliban asserts the right to rule this island because of bloodline, because of birth, solely on his animal nature and not any form of human merit. I inherited this island from my mother, and regardless of the fact that I am not fit to rule intellectually, I couldn't even speak before you arrived, regardless of the fact that I'm morally degenerate and I tried to rape Miranda, and I'm proud of it because if only I had succeeded, I would have had a brood of Calibans, right? This gaggle of creatures to rule over, if only I had been able to rape her. Despite all that, he still asserts the same kind of right to rule this island as would any monarch. Right? I have the right by birth, by bloodline. Now, weaved into this interrogation of, let's say, hierarchical structures and rulership is a reflection on utopia. Gonzalo begins to reflect on the possibility of creating a new kind of civilization on this island. And it's that to which I'd like to turn for a moment. Gonzalo here begins to discuss a kind of utopian vision for the civilization that he could create in this new world. It's a reflection of some prevailing sentiments in the Elizabethan era regarding the possibilities inherent in the new world, the new kinds of governmental systems that we might be able to create there, the new possibilities for civilizational, personal, and social organization that we might have. We've already seen presented in miniature, in microcosm, through these characters and their interactions, some of the possible problems in those old systems, those old structures and orders. Here, we have an exploration of the possibilities in a utopian context. Utopia just means an idealized and perfect civilization or society. It's the opposite of dystopia. So if you think back to something like 1984 or Brave New World, right, those are dystopian novels wherein the civilization is essentially totalitarian in some way. Here, Gonzalo envisions a utopian society that he would construct and rule on this new island. He says, "In the Commonwealth, I would by contraries execute all things. For no kind of traffic would I admit, no name of magistrate, letters should not be known, riches, poverty, and use of service, none, contract, succession, born, bound of land, tithe, vineyard, none. No use of metal, corn, or wine, or oil, no occupation, all men idle, all, and women too, but innocent and pure. No sovereignty, Sebastian, and yet he would be king on it. The latter end of his commonwealth forgets the beginning." So Gonzalo is listing off the categories and the aspects that would define his utopian vision of society or his utopian society. There'd be no traffic, so there'd be no economic system. There'd be no magistrates, no system of law. There'd be no riches or letters. There'd be no education, riches, or poverty. There'd be no use of service or contracts, so private contracts wouldn't exist. And there'd be no hereditary systems of succession. There'd be no born or bound of land, tithe, vineyard, so there'd be no structured or orders to things that we handed on through the generations. There'd be no metal, corn, or wine, or oil, so none of the artifice of technologies would be here. And there'd be no occupation. All men would live in a kind of idle purity, innocence, and women too. They would be free to pursue whatever they wished without any compulsion. Everything would sort of drop from the bushes into their mouths. There'd be no conflict or strife, no need to strive for anything. That's the utopia that I envision. No sovereignty. And then Sebastian and Antonio interrupt, yet he would be king on it, right? He talks about being king of this new realm. There'd be no sovereignty, he says. So the latter end of his commonwealth forgets the beginning. The very idea of creating a commonwealth under his rule implies that there's going to be sovereignty, but by the end of it, it's revealed to be ridiculous because, of course, he's saying there's not going to be any king, not even me. What we have here is, through Gonzalo, a repudiation of any kind of utopian sentiment. Even though Shakespeare, through the other characters in this play and the interactions we've already discussed, recognizes that there are problems inherent in the old systems of power, he's cautioning against any kind of overly optimistic or overly utopian vision of the new kinds of societies that we can make. Because in the end, the great problem of every civilization ultimately is its people. Human beings are not perfectible. Only perfect beings can live in a perfect utopia. All of us, every human being, is always going to be driven to some degree by this desire for riches, this desire to command and control, the ugly, base, and let's say animalistic drives that govern people like Sebastian and Antonio, and oftentimes are covered over with a veneer of nobility, as they are in the case of these two characters. Now, Gonzalo continues on to say, all things in common nature should produce without sweat or endeavor, treason, felony, sword, pike, knife, gun, or need of any engine would I not have. So I wouldn't have any need of any of these things, any weapon or police system. Everything would be perfect and harmonious because we live together in common cause. All of its own foison, all abundance, to feed my innocent people. No marrying amongst his subjects? None, man, all idle, whores and knaves. And that's all you'd have. I would with such perfection, sir, govern, sir, to excel the golden age. So, what he's envisioning here is this golden age, a return to a prelapsarian sort of pre-fall of man state, where everything is idleness and perfection. He's referring back to that idea in Genesis, where the world was created very good, and then Adam and Eve, in this golden world, sin and death and struggle and toil enter into the world. So he's envisioning this return back to innocence. But the only beings capable of living in that Eden, that Garden of Eden that he envisions, are the perfect man and the perfect woman, who are prior to sin, who have no knowledge of it. The world that he envisions, like anyone who envisions a utopian society that could be constructed in this new world, is a farcical joke. It's meant to be ridiculous. And Shakespeare is saying that all these utopian visions are such. Perhaps we can create something better. There are flaws that need to be addressed in that old order. But if you think for a moment that we're going to create an Eden, a paradise, all you're going to do is create a hell of man's own making, because man was not meant for paradise. We're not good enough for it. We're not good enough to make it. And the greatest danger that we could ever imagine facing is not the systems of power that were unjust and corrupt that existed before us, but the new systems that we might create out of a belief that man is perfectible, or that civilization is perfectible through sufficient modification. Now, in the next section, Ariel, invisible to the assembled men, enters in, playing solemn music. Again, we have that idea of the solemn, strange musics of the island coming to the forefront that Shakespeare borrowed from Strachey's account of the storm. So Ariel enters in, and he puts the good characters, let's say, or the characters who are potentially good and repentant, Gonzalo and Alonso, to sleep. And yet, this strange music that causes them to fall into a deep slumber also rouses Sebastian and Antonio. It actually makes them feel more invigorated and awake. It gives Antonio the opportunity to try to convince Sebastian, the brother of the king, to assist him in murdering the two other characters. And he says to Sebastian, in this sort of gradual process of seduction, well, if Ferdinand is truly dead, well, who would inherit the kingdom if your brother were to die? And Sebastian says, well, surely it would be his daughter. His daughter? Antonio says, really? She's so far away. She couldn't rule Naples. Who then would actually rule? Who would be the de facto king? It would be you. And so through this process, Prospero, using Ariel's magic, has created the proper situation. Right? He set the stage, essentially. He set up the scene, and now the other characters inside that scene are beginning to work. Again, Prospero shows his control over the narrative using his magic, using that magic that is explicitly and directly connected with art and language, just like Shakespeare. He's playing out the story of this play, or he's working out and orchestrating the story of this play. And these two characters are given the opportunity to show their evil. They're given the opportunity to plot out this attempt to murder and usurp the positions of the other two characters, Gonzalo and Alonso. And in our interactive class this week, we're going to discuss that along with the introduction to Caliban.